Well, those two questions. Firstly, I think we have to accept that the president has to make that statement to reassure the people of his country and to make sure that this isn't completely painted as a failure, as some people are trying to do. What can they do? Well, it's worth remembering that ISIS Khorasan has been in Afghanistan and has been conducting pretty disgraceful and horrendous attacks in the last few years, whilst the American forces were on the ground, and they weren't able to detect them and disrupt them sufficiently, although some successful operations were carried out. So finding these people on the ground and attacking them is something that may well take a long time. And I'm sure that the CIA and the Pentagon are determined to fulfill the mission that President Biden has set them in terms of punishing these people. But it will take time. And it is very interesting, or it will be very interesting, to see how the Americans operate with the Taliban on this count. They have a choice. They can do it totally independently, and they may well be able to successfully identify these people and hit them. On the other hand, they may well cooperate with the Taliban, who have now a greater degree of intelligence on the ground and who are motivated to try and destroy this organization, not just punish it, but to destroy it because it represents a great threat to them. So it'd be interesting to see how that develops. In terms of whether there will be a threat to the West from extremist groups in Afghanistan, well, again, it very much depends on how things pan out. The extremist groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, have existed in Taliban over the last many years when the American government has been there, or American forces have been there, and they haven't significantly impacted any threat to the West. There have been plots that have been jointly planned in Afghanistan and elsewhere that have been successfully disrupted in Europe. But we must also try to see this thing in context. Afghanistan has not been the greatest area for these extremists to operate from. If people have forgotten that in Yemen, it's probably the only country where Al-Qaeda has controlled vast areas of territory. And they haven't, in the last many years, been able to successfully mount attacks against the West from Yemen, and indeed from the many other countries where these terrorist groups exist. I think it is a fallback to the idea that 9/11 was planned and executed from Afghanistan, which is an idea that deserves a great deal more scrutiny than it's given. But even if one accepts the claims underlying that idea, then that will somehow resurrect itself. But every indication is that the Taliban are determined not to do that. I think the greatest threat, potentially, is if the Taliban leadership that currently exists is allowed to be replaced by a hardliner version of the Taliban from perhaps within its ranks, within maybe the foot soldiers, then there will be the possibility of greater threat to the West. But the current leadership shows every indication that it will only deal with its own problems, and that is in keeping with the culture, the Pashtunwali culture that has existed amongst the Taliban, amongst the Afghans for centuries. They don't tend to export their problems. They tend to be very parochial, nationalistic, and indeed xenophobic. Good question, and my worry is this: that of course they will handle it for public relations reasons, and the problem will come in 5 to 10 years' time, when this outflow of refugees multiplies itself, because each, for refugee will have dependents that they will, over the course of time, want to get out of Afghanistan. And we mustn't forget that before the fall of Kabul, there has been a very significant outflow of refugees for economic reasons. Turkey alone hosted over 150,000 refugees even before the Taliban came back on the scene. So we have a refugee crisis which is primarily economically driven and which has been exacerbated by European and Western media echoing the narrative that the Taliban represent a threat to civil liberties. Of course, what hasn't happened is that the 15 million or so Afghans who live in the countryside who do not feel a threat from the Taliban haven't been given a voice. My worry is that in 5 to 10 years' time, when these refugees are settled in Europe and when there's an economic crisis, what will happen is what has happened in the past. Extremists, right-wing extremists, nationalists in Europe will start to target and maybe even harm refugees in general, not just the Afghan refugees, and blame them for economic downturns and so on. This is something that has happened cyclically in Europe throughout my lifetime. My father came here in the 1960s, and we will see this sadly again. What needs to be done to prevent this is the European politicians and the American politicians to make a commitment to society in general that they will not allow the extremists within the political system in their countries to blame all refugees, all migrants for their economic and other problems. Because this is something we know from history will happen, and they will be scapegoated in the years to come.